was Lenin at the end. Half his brain was virtually liquid towards the end. Massacres on every front. The Civil War was going badly. They won that Civil War because every man on their own side who retreated more than 8 paces, the secret police stood behind them and shot them. And Trotsky introduced that and advocated it in a booklet called The Necessity of Red Terror. The Necessity of Red Terror. I met Corin Redgrave once, who was one of the leaders of the Workers' Revolutionary Party. And Redgrave, who's this sort of rather depressive sort of actor, basically, piped up in the middle of this party as he was chain smoking. He said, when we're in power, he said, we're going to have iron hard destruction of the bourgeois class. Like this. And I said, but Corin, you could be regarded as one of the most bourgeois men in Britain. And he said, no. He said, it's all in the mind. And of course it is all in the mind. He said something very interesting to me about the extraordinary mental arabesque that this theory can cast. Somebody said, well, what about Stalin then, Corin? And he said, Stalin is the recrudescence of the theory of the class enemy, which occurs mentally as a hypostatization within the class that falsifies his ideology and history and is the class enemy at a particular moment of struggle. If you refer to Trotsky's The History of the Revolution, chapter 8, paragraph 92, he tells you everything that you need to know about him. So it is almost an earth-shattering religion. Now, many people, I've known a few Polish people in my life, and Poles learnt Marxism-Leninism at school after the creation of Gomulka's regime after 48. I went to a Catholic school, although I'm not a Catholic, not even a Christian, and you had 4 periods a week of religious knowledge. And they ripped that out and replaced it with Marxism-Leninism, the same 4 periods. You learnt the Paris manuscripts, the early idealistic stuff in 1844, which he then reverses. You then go on to the scientific socialism, so-called, of the German ideology and the groundwork, which wasn't published in East Germany, probably under Ulbricht, really, in 1967. Then you go on to Capital Volume 1 and Capital Volumes 2 and 3, which Engels writes later. Then you go on to Engels' parallel material, which is slightly different to Marx. Then you look at people like Plekhanov. The irony about this pure theory is that without the mountebanks, without the political criminals, without the guerrilla terrorist figures like Stalin, they would have never got anywhere. Because they married this theory to sectarian propaganda and conspiratorialism by small, violent and often criminal groups. And this is a rival tradition that goes back to the French Revolution, if you look at people like Babeuf in the 1790s, but in particular is Blanqui's tradition in the 19th century. Small, close-knit revolutionary bands that almost no one's heard of, who swim around these theoretical groups, wait for a crisis in society to use armed force at a crucial and strategic moment, and then build a structure on the basis of the theory, which often hardens just into a secular theology, whilst they're really concerned with the exertion of pure power. I saw a thing that's interested me recently in Forbes magazine in the United States, which has a rich list, and it said that Castro's personal fortune was $70 million US. 70 million US dollars. And they described him as a communist prince. And there is an interesting side to these types, that often because they take illicit and semi-secret shares in state-owned industries, the families that own the original sugar and tobacco industries in old Cuba would be shot or heaved out to the States. They would reappropriate in the name of the masses, which means a slice for the Castro family. And of course it might be quite small in terms of equity when it's taken, but over 50 odd years builds up to an enormous fund. And yet many communists or Marxists that I've known are in some ways not particularly materialistic people. The whole point in the communist movement is that you often owned nothing, often you left very little except for these monarch types that I've just mentioned, because they lived for the recreation of man. They believed in a total change in almost all areas of society. Probably the most extreme communist experiment of all was Pol Pot's in Kampuchea. Now Pol Pot of course wasn't his real name. It in some ways means political potential, which is what Maoist instructors in China called him. Political potential, Pol Pot. He has political potential. Pot himself was a nerdy little man with a lopsided smile and a sadistic desire to impose a type of peasant-based anarchistic Marxist theory. One of the interesting things is when he was a student, and Indochina strongly influenced by French imperialism, of course, when he was a student in Paris, he sat in on lectures by Sartre, by de Beauvoir, by a feminist theorist called Kristeva, who was also a Maoist at the time, and he sort of wrote down things that they said, but in a sort of cretinous, future sadistic way, like, the family is a gun in the hands of the bourgeois class. Destroy the family. Yes, destroy the family. Make everyone live in communes. Destroy the bond between mother and child and husband and wife. Everyone is therefore part of the masses. And non manipulable is wonderful. And when he got the chance to do it in a society with gangs of terroristic teenagers, many of them out of their minds on drugs and so on, he did it. He put people in large barns, and if you said you wanted to see your uncle, he said, I'm your uncle. And the person was dragged out and their head beaten in with the butt of a machine gun because you weren't worthy a bullet. So that is the sort of high theory. These French Parisian literati types have hardly ever had a problem in their lives at all, who are rebelling against the norms of their own culture, almost as play. But they give the language and the sort of action theatre to these types who internalise it all. And although most of them just remain Gerard Healy-like idle dreamers on the margins of Western society, if they ever really got the chance to do it, they would impose it because they believe it's morally right to make that imposition. And the idea that these theories are morally right is important in relation to their reception at a later time. Because I believe that contemporary liberalism has recycled a large number of these theories and treated them, purged of nasty Soviet, Maoist and other accretions, as something normative, as something given. 70 years ago, many of the values that face us in the media and elsewhere would have, amongst normal and apolitical people, been regarded as abhorrent. Now they are normative, and even to speak out against them is to essentially embrace thought criminality. But there's a degree to which the reason this has occurred is because a hybrid is developed between post-war secular liberalism and the Marxism of the past. And this is what I'd like to discuss. The Frankfurt School grew up in Germany as a particular response to modern life. Marxism believes in crisis. Everything is in crisis. The family's in crisis, class relations are in crisis, race, which they don't accept as a social concept, because it's an anthropological concept and isn't reducible to economic materialism, but it does exist because it exists in the minds of reactionaries, and so on. They think that the endless critique of what has gone before prepares new grounds and vistas of struggle. So the purpose of the Frankfurt School was to critique all Marxism, to bring back a more purified and critically intelligent form of the dialectic which could be used in modernity. The Frankfurt School is quite complicated because there's a strong streak of pessimism and despair in it, which is very unusual in Marxism. Another really unusual thing is that very Germanic forms of Marxism, such as those proffered by Lowenthal, by Horkheimer, by Adorno, by Naumann and others who were prominent in the school, linked to forms of Anglo-Saxon, American and empirical thought. Why is this? Because of the existence of fascist governments in Central Europe in a certain time, all of these types sought refuge in the United States. When Adorno was at the University of California and the Frankfurt School had been closed down by a certain notorious government in Germany at that time, he developed various psychological theories which are quite interesting, even in relation to this present audience. He developed what he called the F scale. F was for F for fascism. And this is a personality test which under a different name is still used quite widely. It's a test for the authoritarian personality to see how fascistic you are in relation to trigger words. Many of these ideas have fed through into the doctrine which is now called political correctness, but they've morphed and changed over time. And rigidity in relation to prior assumption. Ability to follow a leader without question. Undue respect for authority, dialectically related to the idea that you want to exercise authority yourself. A sort of love-hate relationship to the police. And this sort of thing. And Adorno ticks all of these boxes.